glad to see that we have some noted dignitaries in the audience here, and we really appreciate your attendance. Thanks for being with us. I hope this turns out to be a good learning experience for all of us. I would assume that everybody here knows Greg Sekula. Greg has been the director of the Southern Regional Office of Indiana Landmarks. We're going on 9 years now. Time flies. But Greg has done a lot of help to this town. He and his assistant, Laura Renwick, were very instrumental in helping get the design guidelines pulled together for us. And he is here now, tonight, to tell us how to put them to good use. So, without wasting any more time, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and I hope you all find this very fun.
Thank you, Rich. I may have to step on this side because I think my little connector piece that allows me to advance the slides is on this side of the laptop, so I'll stand over here. What I'm going to do today is talk about this whole business of historic district ordinances and guidelines and how they fit together. And so we're going to kind of talk about a whole range of issues as it affects this business of design review in particular. That's what we're going to focus on, of course. But I'm going to use the term Historic Preservation Commission, recognizing fully well that here in Madison, we call that animal a slightly different name with the Historic District Board of Review. So I'll have a few references to that, but for those of you who may not be familiar as well with that term, essentially we're looking at using those interchangeably because here in Madison it's the Historic District Board of Review that is functioning as the Historic Preservation Commission. Many of you are aware of the fact that there are a lot of misconceptions out there about what the role of the Preservation Commission is in the community. And here's a great example. Your grandma's sitting on the front porch, and he's got a little violation notice harped on his head, basically saying they haven't gotten their certificate of appropriateness for grandma's changing wardrobe. Obviously, that's a little extreme, but nonetheless, it underlies the fact that a lot of people just don't realize what the role of the Preservation Commission is in the community. We see this all the time with people making comments about not only what the Commission reviews, but also the fact that it's punitively based, which in theory the Commission is not. It is responsible for enforcing through decisions relating to certificates of appropriateness what is or is not consistent with the ordinance and guidelines. But the actual role of enforcement is actually something that's handled by the municipality, the city, and it's a separate arm. But a lot of people, of course, tie those two together. We're always concerned by public perception of what is involved with going before the Preservation Commission. And we hear it all the time. People say, oh no, I've got to go before the review board, I've got to go before the Preservation Commission. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how to make that process more manageable from both the perspective of the applicant, the public, as well as from the Commission's perspective. And that's what we're going to look at today. First things first, and that is, let's understand a little bit about what the local historic district means and how it's regulated. First of all, understand that the local historic district is established by the town council through an ordinance and is a form of zoning that we typically call an overlay zone. One of the key elements of that issue is that it governs appearance and not use. Many people assume, I hear this all the time when called, well, am I going to be able to operate a business out of my home, or am I going to be able to put a tattoo parlor in this business? Well, if zoning allows it, yes, the tattoo parlor is going to have to meet certain design regulations, but if the underlying zoning allows it, the historic district ordinance is not going to affect the underlying use of the property. And that's an important distinction to make. As I mentioned, changes must be approved by a local appointed government body, known as the Historic Preservation Commission, or as I mentioned here in Madison, the Historic District Board of Review. One of the things that it's amazing is we work in communities across Indiana and in other communities where I've worked in the past, where I staffed for 13 years in commissions in both Missouri and North Carolina. It's amazing how many people, including city council people, even the mayor, detach themselves from the commission from the standpoint of not recognizing a fundamental truth, and that is the commission is a body of local government and is an instrument of local government. Somehow it's the historical society, right? We always hear that term, but in reality, it is a functioning board within local government, and therefore, what happens with the commission is a reflection of what happens with the city. So it's imperative as a community that this board be functioning and have the support of the community, because it, in essence, is a reflection of local governments working in the community. Work that's approved by the commission has to receive what's called a certificate of appropriateness. We call that COA. And typically that COA is a document that is required before a building permit can be issued. And again, we've seen situations where the left hand is not talking to the right often within government, where the building commissioner's office has never heard of what a COA is, and therefore a building permit is issued and the commission's approval process is somehow ignored in that process. So we've got to understand the language and know that approved work must occur before that building permit is issued. What is the role of the Preservation Commission in the community? There's really sort of four roles that the commission plays. First and foremost is design review, which is what we're going to focus on largely tonight. But also the commission plays an important role in providing technical assistance. And this is where I think, oftentimes we lose an opportunity with the commissions that we have in our communities. If we indeed have qualified people serving on the commission, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, there's really a wonderful opportunity for that board to play a vital role in the community in terms of helping and assisting property owners on their rehabilitation issues that they're facing. And if we tout and give commissions the opportunity, in many ways, it's unfortunate that the commission meets largely to review applications in this sort of regulatory framework, when in reality, I wish we had more meetings where maybe for the first 30 minutes, it's a Q&A period where the public could come in and actually say, here's my problem that I'm having. How do I, I've got brick that's spalling, or I've got, built-in gutters that are leaking. I need some help on how to resolve these issues. How do I do it? And allow for time for those kinds of questions to be dealt with. And if the commission doesn't have the expertise, maybe it can bring in people in the community who have that expertise to assist and answer questions. And that way, that technical assistance role is really playing a more critical role in the community in terms of being a benefit, and the public is seeing that. So I think we underscore that, unfortunately. We need to refocus on that. Watchdog is another very important role. Oftentimes, we kind of envision our nonprofit organizations playing the watchdog role, and they do. But in many ways, the watchdog role is also a function of local government. The Preservation Commission, more than just being a regulatory body, is also vested with the idea of looking at preservation holistically in the community and recognizing where there's going to be issues in the community that need to be addressed. It may be making recommendations to the council on additional historic districts that need to be established. It may mean advocating from the standpoint of looking for preservation incentives in the community to help property owners with their issues in the community. If we see that people are struggling to preserve original windows or save slate on roofs that are prolific in the community, whatever that issue may be, providing advice and consultation to the local council is an important function that the Preservation Commission can do, and that's because of its watchdog. It's got those visions out there, looking at what are the issues affecting the community. It may be an issue of we really need to be aware as a community that, now that the hospital is making the move up to the hill, what's going to happen with those historic buildings that are in and around the hospital area, and what is, as a commission, can we be doing to make sure that this is an issue that the community is being proactive about as that process is occurring. That's a perfectly legitimate function of a review board or a commission. And then lastly, education. Providing workshops, seminars, trying to educate, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the design guidelines being a really important tool that the community can use to educate the public about preservation issues and rehabilitation. When we talk about this business of design review, there's really a toolkit that the local preservation commission has at its disposal. And there are 4 fundamental components of that, and I want to talk briefly about those. First and foremost, there's the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Commission bylaws, another important element that the commission uses in its functioning process. Policies and procedures, and then lastly, the design guidelines. So let's touch upon each of those. First tool I mentioned is the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And this is, as I mentioned, preservation commissions are really creatures of local government, and as such, they really are creatures of zoning, because it is the town council that created the local preservation district, and through an ordinance, that ordinance is solidly, if it's sound, is solidly based on state statute, state enabling legislation. And I have the reference here in Indiana Code 36-7-11, which outlines how a preservation commission is structured. Landmarks has, and for those of you who may not have ever seen this, but we have a model ordinance that has been created that was developed through the assistance of Barnes and Thornburg, a legal firm that is our legal counsel at Landmarks. And they took the state statute and they crafted a model ordinance. We've recently updated that ordinance, and one of the things that I would encourage us to have a conversation about here in the community is really a need to get our preservation ordinance here in Madison in alignment with that state statute. The ordinance, the way it's structured right now, has a lot of variations that, although I think at the time in the 1980s when it was enacted, were probably sufficient, there is a lack of clarity as to its consistency with state enabling legislation, and I think it would be beneficial for the community to really explore kind of reframing that ordinance to make it more solidly aligned with state statute. The ordinance here, as I said, was amended, or was created in 1982. It was amended most recently back in 2009, in November, when there was a provision added that basically allowed the review board and the city council to basically take into account the use of these design guidelines that the community worked to create as part of its decision-making process. And again, that was not clearly defined in the existing ordinance, which again is sort of a staple element of what a good sound preservation ordinance should have. So that's something that we want to probably look at a little bit more carefully in the community. The second tool are the bylaws of the commission. And I can't say with certainty that I've actually seen bylaws for the commission here. I know we've got a few rules and procedures that we have, but I don't know if I've got the most updated version, if there is something. But one of the things that's really important is for the commission to have a written and adopted set of bylaws that help to establish how that board is going to govern as a body. And that will cover everything that basically talks about voting procedures and how, are you following Robert's Rules of Order? How is the public going to be treated as part of this process? How are appeals dealt with from the commission standpoint? And very key component here, the bylaws help to ensure consistent operation and equal treatment of all applicants. Again, something that every functioning board needs to have in place. And why is that so important? It's critical for building what we call that defensible record. As a body that is quasi-judicial in capacity, meaning that you're rendering decisions that affect property rights, it is extremely important that the governing board, the review body, have a defensible record of its decision making. And we're going to focus a little bit on that tonight. And as I mentioned, some of the things that bylaws can cover, meeting dates and times, notice requirements, filing fees, voting procedures, all of those that are covered in bylaws. The third deals sort of related to bylaws, but policies and procedures. And these are usually kind of an expanded text that's available that provides the public with a basic understanding of procedures and operations that the commission has in place. Not all commissions have separate procedures and bylaws, but a lot of them do. And I think for good governance, there's something that should be in place. Oftentimes, these guidelines are not legally binding. Sometimes they are, but they may operate, for example, in the ordinance, there may be a provision that says staff has the ability to approve certain items that come before it if these changes are deemed not significant to the character-defining features of the property. The policies and procedures will spell out in greater detail what those elements are that staff could review internally. So if an applicant comes together, for example, and maybe they're painting their property and they're just going to change the colors, but there's an established color palette that the local community has accepted. If they fall within that, and some commissions regulate colors, others do not. But if they fall within that, this policy and procedure provision will explain what that is. Or it may say that things like fences in backyards that are not visible from the street or that are partially visible can be approved by the local preservation staff person as opposed to going before the full commission. So I think it's good practice to have those policies and procedures written down and used to kind of expand the operations of the local commission. And then finally, design guidelines. And guidelines really are the foundation of what the commission's operations are. And before the review board here was operating really under a skeleton grouping of guidelines that were incorporated into the ordinance. But fundamentally, the tool that you have now really expands that greatly and gives you a lot more of an ability to understand how to approach changes that are brought before you. And it also gives the public a very clear understanding of what the expectations are in the community. So really the guidelines are what they say they are. They are the guide. They should guide both the applicant's work, the public's work, and how they approach their approval process before the commission, as well as the commission's decision itself. An informed public is critical, and that's one of the things I want to talk about today. I mean, we often see examples where people have a certain mindset and they go into a meeting before the board and they say, by golly, I want this, it's come hell or high water, it's going to be what I want. And if we go in with that kind of attitude as the public, we're destined to create often an adversarial situation and a controversial situation. And no one ends up winning in that context. So the public has certain responsibilities that it needs to bring to the process when it comes before the review board. And I want to talk about that here. First and foremost, I think if we want the process, oftentimes we're very intimidated when we go into a commission meeting because, we're having to stand up before this board. We've got this group of people behind us who, are listening to what our business is, and we don't want people necessarily knowing what we want to do with our property, but they're there, and we've got these people before us who we may not know very well, and they're going to dictate what we're going to do to our property. So we feel very intimidated when we go in. But I think there are certain things that we need to do to hopefully increase the comfort level. And first and foremost, it's requesting and reviewing a copy of the design guidelines. Now that you have a published set of design guidelines, it's imperative that the public have access to those guidelines and be able to review them before they put their application together. And to some degree, the responsibility for that ultimately falls with the property owner, but equally as important, it's imperative that the city and the staff provide the public with those guidelines. So when someone comes in to get their application, it's not a matter of, well, they didn't ask for them. It's a matter of giving them a copy of the guidelines and asking them, well, what is it you would like to do with your property? Well, I'm interested in changing my windows, or I'm interested in fixing my brickwork. Well, we have a set of published design guidelines, and it just so happens that we have an entire section on masonry repair, or windows, or whatever that feature or element may be. And we encourage you to read this so you understand up front what is going to guide the Commission's decision-making as it reviews these applications. So that's a key element. I think secondly, and equally as important, is the public needs to make a good faith effort to try and follow those guidelines. In many respects, the guidelines are because this process was a public process where the guidelines were established. There were public meetings. Opportunities were available for public input. These guidelines, in essence, have created a chronicle of the community's standards and expectations for property. So we hope that the mindset that one goes in when they make an application for a certificate of appropriateness is to understand that they're buying into the process and making a good faith effort to try to comply with those guidelines. The application process is equally as critical. So often, I think where a lot of the conflict comes in is when there's a lack of clarity as to what the property owner is attempting to do and what the Commission may or may not understand that the property owner wants to do. So key to that process is making sure that the application form is filled out properly and as much information as possible is provided. Now, in many cases, that burden often falls to the staff of the Commission to provide guidance to the property owner to help answer that question. As a staff person, when I served with local preservation commissions, I would put myself, as I review the application, obviously I look at an application and say, okay, well, I'm not clear here on exactly, what materials they wanted to use to replace the railing on their porch, or to do, they're saying they want to put a new front door on and it's going to be a 4-panel door, but they haven't said it's going to be a steel door, is it going to be a wooden door? So what I would do is, if I got an application and hadn't had a chance to talk to the applicant before they submitted, well before it went before the review board, I would call them up and ask them these questions. I would meet with them. I would go over to the property, take a look at it, and try to understand as best I could what the situation is. Because as much as I was also an advisor to the Commission, I also felt I was an ambassador to the property owner to try and effectively communicate to the board, help the property owner clarify to the review board what they were trying to ask for. And if there were red flags that I was aware of early on, I would alert the property owner, like, I want to replace my windows. Well, I would say, you are entitled to come before the review board and ask to have your windows replaced. But I need to let you know up front that the guidelines say, that preservation of historic windows is the preferred treatment for dealing with this issue. So you need to know up front that that's going to be an issue of discussion. And here are the guidelines, and here are the reasons why the Commission supports that decision in its decision making. Now, you may have extraordinary circumstances that render a reason why the Commission should take exception to the guidelines and honor your request. And those may be very legitimate, and you are entitled to provide those, and we'll take those into account. But the reality is you've got to provide them with adequate information. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Equally as important as well is being present. I can't tell you how many times I dealt with projects where I met with an applicant and they had this project that they wanted to accomplish, and then for whatever reason, you get to the meeting and the applicant doesn't show up. Well, the staff cannot represent the applicant, and the commission cannot second guess what the applicant's intentions are or get information if someone's not there. So it's absolutely critical that the person be present at the meeting and be available to answer questions along the way. As a property owner, how do I, as a kind of a general conceptual approach to this, what are the kind of the tenets or rules that I should live by? I as a property owner may not be in a position where I'm going to absorb or know everything that's in those set of design guidelines, and I may be intimidated by 50-some pages of verbiage. But I think there's some basic principles that I want to talk about that I think are critical. And I label those identify, retain, and preserve. That's the basic tenet of what the commission is about and what this whole business of historic district design review is about. The first thing we always do, because we are focusing on historic properties, is recognizing that a historic property is special because it stood the test of time. Okay? It wasn't created yesterday. It was created 50, 100, 150 years ago, whatever that date might be. But what's remarkable about it, it's a survivor. It's withstood the test of time. Many of us collect antiques, right? We love our antiques, and I know Jack Patchen, I saw Rhonda here. Jack has talked about, when he got into the business of windows, he was into antique cars. And if you've ever seen an antique car lover, you know how much they cherish those cars, and they want, are so proud of the fact that 95% of that car is the original fabric. Okay? Well, and same way with our antiques. We all love to watch Antiques Roadshow. And we've all heard the story about, my God, if we finished the antique and lost the original patina, we've diminished the value of that, and depending on the significance of the piece, it can be a substantial diminishment in value. Well, the real McCoy is important, and when we look at our historic houses, we need to look at it in the same context. That what makes these buildings special, what gives them their inherent value, is the fact that they possess these original materials. So first and foremost, the vintage, keeping and retaining is really what we're trying to do. But first, we've got to identify what those features are. Why are they important? And collectively, those pieces individually make up the whole. And it's the whole that we're trying to preserve ultimately. Repairing is always the preferred option to replacement. And, it's been interesting over the last several years. I've been in meetings and discussions, often heated, about preservation issues. And, there very much still is alive this sort of Disney World mentality of, if it looks like it did, it doesn't matter if we save the old. As long as it looks like what was there, that's all that matters. And the reality is, that's not what it's about. It's about trying to retain and keep. I mean, again, use the analogy of the car or the antique. The reproduction is never as valuable as the real antique. So, as we look at our buildings, we need to think in positive terms about those important features and trying to keep those features intact, if at all possible. That's what we're striving for. Even if in-kind replacement is ultimately, what we're striving for, ideally trying to save that feature is utmost of importance. Ultimately, what is it all about? It's about extending the life of the historic material. I mean, all of us want to live as long as we can. We're in the business of extending life, and that's what preservation is all about. We hope that these buildings that we've inherited today will outlive us, and we'll be here for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And if we keep the sense of the striving for the idea of, keep as much of this original fabric as we can here, because, someday everything will have to be replaced. I mean, it has a useful life. But if we can extend it, if we can propagate it, that's what it's about in the end. And ultimately, what are we talking about? We are talking about integrity, historic integrity. And that's a term you often hear a review board member talk about. You'll hear that in preservation, National Register program, the issue of historic integrity. And these are rooted in some federal preservation guidelines, which are called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. They actually officially now have a much longer name when you tie the guidelines in with them. I've got it written down here. It's a mouthful. But ultimately, there are 10 fundamental standards that are sort of the foundation. And I'm not going to focus on all of them, but I'm going to point out a few of them that I think are germane to our conversation. And the first is a property, which is standard number 1. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and its environment. We live in a world where uses change. Obviously, adaptive reuse is something that we're all accustomed to, and it's a big part of preservation. We're in a building right now that is an example of that adaptive reuse. But here we are is a great example with the truss works, the brickwork, the flooring. An effort has been made to try and retain these character-defining features of this building, despite the fact that we're now sitting in a building having a meeting, in a building that was never intended to be a meeting space. Example here is the old town hall in Huntingburg in Du Bois County, which now is an office building as well as a reception hall. But driving by, that building still retains the character of its original intended use, and that was the City Hall building. That was the brand sort of landmark of that particular community. And if you went inside that building, you would see many original features retained as part of that adaptive reuse. The historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize the property shall be avoided. Here's obviously a fairly bad example, and I want anyone know where this building might be? Campbellton, Indiana. Obviously, here we have a building that original windows have been removed, windows have been bricked up, smaller windows have been put in. The windowless building obviously looks out of place and somewhat jarring. So obviously, what we don't want to do is to remove features and alter buildings that avoid character. So standard number 2, very important. Standard number 4, most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. This one is a little bit more of a challenge. And a lot of people grapple with how to approach this one. And I guess the analogy I would make is that as we all age, obviously, we all change. And sometimes, those changes aren't necessarily for the better, but in the end, we are who we are, and we have to deal with who we are. So, can we make changes to ourselves? Yes, we can. We can go to the gym more regularly, we can watch what we eat, we can do all of those things. But ultimately, we've got to look at, fundamentally the fact that the reality is that things and buildings do change. And importantly here, the Commission's job is not to prohibit change. It is to help manage change in a way that ensures that the historic character of the property is maintained. Right? Managing change is the function of the board. It's not to stop or freeze a building. We often, in the preservation business, talk to folks who are interested in rehabbing buildings, and they want to use some of the federal tax credits that are available. And the question that always comes up when I'm talking to people who are learning about the program is, well, I'm going to have to restore my building back to the way it was, right? That's going to be part of the deal if I want to take advantage of this tax credit. And the answer to that is no. What the tax credit program, it's not the restoration investment tax credit, it's the rehabilitation investment tax credit. Rehabilitation acknowledges the fact that buildings have changed and that those changes are part of the reality of existence. But what we want to do is make sure that as work goes on, that it's done in a manner that preserves and protects the historic integrity of that building. And likewise, in these situations. Now, what is sound practice with preservation related to this standard is that if there's good, documented evidence of what a building looked like prior to a change taking place, then there is a justification potentially for returning a building back to an earlier appearance. But that doesn't necessarily have to happen, and sometimes those changes can be significant. I threw this example in here, and the purists would say, okay, this beautiful Italianate house had this very incongruous craftsman porch added to it at the turn of the century, and by golly, it's just inappropriate for that house. We should tear it off and not think a day about it. Well, the fact that that porch has been on there for at least 50 years, and may be indicative of other changes that occurred at that property. Let's say, hypothetically, that the first African-American mayor for the city of Jeffersonville resided here, and he had his announcement speech for his mayoral candidacy on that front porch. Well, all of a sudden now, that front porch has taken on some significance, right? Now, that may be kind of a stretch, but the reality is changes can take place to properties, and those changes can be significant, and they document changes that have occurred to that building. So we should always be mindful of those. And really the litmus test really is, if there are older changes, at least 50 years or older, we really want to take pause and evaluate those changes before we decide if we're going to remove them and change them. Distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize the property shall be preserved. Obviously, there's a lot of question as to what are those features. We really need to look at the building as a whole and evaluate those. Obviously, things like cornices, window hoods, materials of the building are all very important to tell us about the character of the property. So we want to look at all of those in totality and weigh what are significant and what are not, and make an effort to make sure that those distinctive features are kept. I think the overall awareness of preservation in the last 20 to 30 years has made this less of an issue. I mean, we're not seeing I can't say uniformly, but for the most part, people aren't going in there and saying, I want to tear off my cornice, or I want to cover my stone facade with vinyl siding. I mean, they're mindful of the inherent beauty and importance of keeping these features. But there are elements that oftentimes are neglected that we don't look at. So being mindful of standard number 5 is really important. Deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or temporal evidence. Obviously, we see levels of deterioration at all stages, but again, being mindful of what we talked about in the past, with this example, obviously, if we've got missing features and features that are very deteriorated, but we still have elements that may be able to be preserved and retained. And rather than saying, oh, we're just going to rip it all off and we're going to go in and replicate that, the real value is being able to say, okay, this is an original post, this is an original post, this is one, and this is one, and we had to maybe replicate this one here because it's too deteriorated to repair. We were able to keep, some decorative brackets, but obviously there was some that were missing or partially missing, and we opted to duplicate those. So again, trying to see the inherent value in keeping as much original fabric as possible and repairing it needs to be a part of our mentality and our thinking. I want to show you an example here of a kind of illustrating the Secretary of the Interior Centers. This is my home in New Albany, Indiana. When my wife and I purchased our house in 2002, this is what the house looked like. The original porch, when we bought the house, we knew that the porch was obviously changed. We didn't know what it looked like originally, but luckily a neighbor, shortly after we moved in, brought in this historic photograph showing the house as it originally stood with this full level porch. So we used this as our documentary evidence to recreate as closely as we could the original porch. Now, were there some variations that we had to do? We couldn't, for example, get the exact detail on some of these brackets. We blew it up, and it was so, the pixelation was such that we couldn't get an exact design, but we came up with something that we thought was very much in character with it, and attempted as best we could to replicate the chamfer posts, the wing brackets, the The balustrade up at the top, which is a little hard to read here in this photograph, there's a Songbird balustrade along the top. Again, we relied on pictorial evidence to do it. In this case, we had no original fabric left, except the original stone steps survived. So we kept the original stone steps in place and left those and recreated our porch to, again, recreate the historic appearance of the property. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk now a little bit about some of the community expectations of the commission. Because we talked now a little bit about what we expect of the public when they come before the commission. But the commission or the review board also has expectations put upon it that we must also, I think, discuss. Oh, I don't want to do that. Oh, they have to, let me see here.
It's good at the next.
Expectations of the review board. Commission is a function, again, of local government, operates in a professional and transparent manner in all times. And this is something we expect of our local body politic. It's something we should expect of our commission because they are a function of local government. Information on the process, including the application form, schedules, and guidelines are easily accessible to the public. I will tell you that I have been to the review board meeting in Madison on many occasions, and I've always been disappointed when I've walked in and never found extra copies of the agenda sitting there for me to pick up to be able to know what the agenda of the review board is. It's a great mystery to me because I think we should have copies of the applications available. You may not have to make copies for everyone, but there should be a copy of the application up there on the table so that the public has an opportunity to look at it if they want to. And I think, because so often what happens is you're sitting there and you're hearing this exchange and this discussion, but you're really not clear from the public's perspective as to what's going on. And the review board is not necessarily articulating to the public the scope of the project. One of the things that I would certainly recommend as a staff person when I served on the commission, one of the things that we always did was we gave a summary of what the application request was. It wasn't just, we read the agenda item and then we asked the staff and the applicant to come up and not just come up to answer questions, but to give an overview in their own words of what the application was. And that really provided some good framework, and oftentimes it helped answer questions. As they explained their project, it answered questions that you didn't have to then riddle the property owner with, when they stood up there. And it put them more at ease because they could explain in their own words. Again, if the staff person is playing its role, it's talked with the property owner, and also has a grasp of what's there, so it can add information, it can help the applicant in describing what they're proposing to do, because oftentimes the applicant may not be familiar with the language, and it's difficult to try and describe what they're trying to do. So the staff person can play an important role in helping to define that process. So that's very important. And to that point, I want to underscore this, and that is ensuring that commission members that demonstrate interest or expertise in these related fields is absolutely critical. You do no one any favors by putting someone on a board in which they do not feel like they have expertise or knowledge. Because what ultimately is going to happen is they're going to be dead space sitting on that board, and they're not going to open their mouth because they don't want to embarrass themselves. And they may feel intimidated because they don't want to, they don't know what questions to ask. So it's absolutely critical that you get qualified people on the board. And enough said about that, but it's important. And typically, your ordinance outlines and says the state enabling legislation talks about the qualified individuals and serving and having expertise in these areas, getting those people on board. Again, if we go back to what is the role of the commission in the community, technical assistance, watchdog, education. If you're going to have those functions in your local preservation commission, you've got to have people who have a knowledge base on there. Does that mean that there's no room to put someone on the board who's interested, who maybe doesn't have a lot of deep knowledge but has a genuine interest? Absolutely not. You can have those kinds of people on there. And it's a way of building and educating the public about playing the role. But you want to have a predominant number of your people on that board having some expertise or knowledge or training. And training is key. Importantly, commission members believe in the process, they maintain a positive attitude, and recognize that they are providing a community service in the community. Can't underscore that enough. I know we have some of our town council members here, and I'm sure they understand that process. They are there representing the community and obviously trying to provide that community service. That's why they're in public office. They believe in the process of local government and believe that it can play a positive role in the community. And that's how we want all of our boards and commissions to function. When a commissioner goes through this process of design review, it's absolutely critical that they, on a regular basis, go and look at the property. Does that mean they have to engage in contact with the property owner and have a lengthy discussion? No. But they at least have to go drive by the property with their application in their hand and make sure that they're understanding what it is that's coming before them. One of the things that we did when I worked for the city of New Bern, North Carolina, which I found immensely helpful to the commission, and this might be something that I would recommend here in Madison, and that is, in the days when you used to have the old camcorders out there that you could go out, I would videotape the property as a staff person, all around, all the issues. If we were talking about, changing a roof or windows or looking at siding, I'd videotape it. We'd have a TV screen up in the courtroom where the commission was meeting. I'd pop the video, a VCR tape in there, and we would have a video of that house available that I could fast forward, I could stop, pause it, and we would have a basis for being able to make discussions. It was helpful for the commission, it was helpful for the property owner, because they could say, well, now this is the window I have a problem with, it's this right here deck in the corner, or this is the gutter, that's the problem. Instead of trying to describe it, in ambiguous terms and not having an ability to describe it, or particularly, and if a commissioner hadn't looked at the property, they had no clue as to what the issue was. Equally as important, it also informed the public about the issue. It gave them a sense of knowing what was going on. Because again, an informed public is an important part of the process. So, it's imperative as a board member that you visit the site, but I think having that added benefit of having some video coverage or images at the meeting would be a very helpful exercise. One of the no-nos that we often see, and this is human nature. I mean, we're all, even the most seasoned commission member is going to fall, unfortunately, to this, at least once. And that is trying to interject their own personal preferences in an application. It's very hard not to do that. But really, what the ordinance and what the guidelines are about is trying to be as objective as possible and basing your decision-making on this established set of written design guidelines and trying not to interject your own personal preferences into a project. One of the hardest things, and I still struggle with this, is that you as a commission member are not responsible for designing the project for the applicant. And that's one of the hardest things to grapple. If someone comes in and they meet the intent of the guidelines, it may not be the most ideal situation, but the reality is, if it meets the intent of the design guidelines, really you are obligated to pass it based on its conformity to the guidelines. Even though you might think, gosh, if Bob Wolf were doing the project, he'd do an exemplary job and have this wonderful addition, but, Harry Carey's doing it, and it's not going to be exempt. It's not going to be exemplary. So, but it meets the intent of the guidelines. So ultimately, you've got to look at it from that standpoint, and trying to interject the personal preferences in it is always a challenge. this is something that I really want to stress, and that is the importance of the written findings of fact and motions. I'm not going to venture to guess, but I will say I have been at some review board meetings. I have never heard a finding of fact or statement of reasons ever articulated for a decision that has been made. And let me give you kind of an example here. This is just kind of the language. And we work as when Landmarks works with several commissions on the staff level. And this is one of the many training things that we really work on. And that is, after the conversation, after you've met with the applicant, you've asked the questions, you've discussed the guidelines, do they conform or do they not conform? Ultimately, when a decision's made, it's not, oh, I move that we approve the application. Second, all in favor, aye. Okay, let's turn to the next application. Not that easy. Again, that quasi-judicial role that you play, the written record is absolutely critical, particularly if we're looking at a possible challenge to that decision down the road. It's imperative that you make these findings. So I'm on the commission, and after the discussion, Mr. Chairman, I move that we find that the Madison Historic District Board of Review find as a fact that the proposed project at 235 Walnut Street, if constructed according to the plans as submitted on September 23rd, 2010, is compatible with the character of the district for the following reasons. One, the applicant is going to use a soft mortar mix, lime-based mortar mix to repair the crumbling masonry on their house, which is in conformity with guideline number X on page such and such in the design guidelines. Number two, the windows on the front elevation of the house are going to, the buttons on the windows are going to be repaired with epoxy so as to retain the original windows on the building. And this is consistent with guideline number 12 on page 74 of our residential design guidelines. This is the standard decision-making process that a review board should go at. This should be the way you do business. This is the kind of language that you're supposed to have. And you break it out, you reference the guidelines specifically, and what that does is at the end of the day, after it's written down, the staff then takes that back. They not only write up the minutes, they're providing a certificate of appropriateness to the applicant, and they're articulating in these words exactly what the commission has approved. So Harry Carey gets his application, Bob Wolf gets his application, and he knows exactly what the commission's decision was and what it was based on. And if something happens that's contrary to that, you can go back and say, well, we approved it, it was based on this, and you did this, and so we've got a problem. Or, someone questions it and said, well, why was that approved? Well, very clearly, they can read the minutes of the commission's decision and find out what the rationale was for that decision-making process. And that is one of the things that I don't see happening on a regular basis here, is that type of thing. And that makes the city, again, the review board is an entity of the city. That makes the city vulnerable to litigation at every decision that it makes, because to be able to go back and to provide, if I were the attorney for an applicant who was unhappy about a decision that was made, I couldn't necessarily go back to the written record and necessarily find out a rationale for why the review board did what it did. And so it's imperative that those findings of fact are made. Now, the fact that you've got design guidelines makes that process easier, because you can now clearly expand or identify verbiage that supports your decision. Whereas before, when we were operating without guidelines, it was a little nebulous because there was some references in the ordinance, but there wasn't a whole lot, so you were really at a disadvantage. But now that we've got this tool at our disposal, it's I think, a little easier to do that. And then the second issue is to approve or disapprove the certificate of appropriateness. So really two motions are made. The first is to make your finding, to cite your guidelines, and the second is to then make a motion to either approve and issue a certificate of appropriateness, or to disapprove and not issue a certificate. So both sets of motions need to be made. guidelines, and I'm just going to hit these quickly because we got design guidelines that contain simple, direct language. I think your new guidelines do that very well. That's a key. They are specific enough to provide clear guidance, and that's from both perspectives, from the public's perspective as well as from the commission's perspective. That's why they're typically in bullet form. They're not 30 pages of text on the merits of soft mortar mixes for historic masonry. They're based on bullet items that are meant to provide guidance. They're organized in some sort of logical way. I've seen guidelines organized differently. I think Madison guidelines are organized alphabetically. Others are based on sort of a sequence of how a building would be, from the roof down to the foundation or the foundation up to the roof. It just depends on how they're done, but it's done in a way that the public can easily, it's indexed. It provides, clarity as to where people can find information. That's always very important. And they're also based on local characteristics. I lived in North Carolina, New Bern, North Carolina, which is a beautiful historic town in the coastal plain of North Carolina. It was the colonial capital of North Carolina. And one of the big issues in the South and in New Bern was standing seam metal roofs on historic houses. The majority of the houses in New Bern had standing seam metal roofs. So in our particular design guidelines manual, the Commission really emphasized the importance of preserving those roofs because they were an important part of the character of the historic district. But that may not be a characteristic of a historic district in Logansport, Indiana, where maybe ornamental slate was more of an issue, or some other feature. In Madison, you have a tendency to have more brick buildings than you have frame. But in other communities, there may be more of a preponderance of frame buildings than brick. So the guidelines should acknowledge this uniqueness and should address that. And I think the Madison guidelines do a good job of acknowledging some of those special unique characteristics of your community. And importantly, going back to that education component, they offer design solutions. The discussion on windows, the discussion on masonry, not only says, well, you have to use a soft lime-based mortar. Well, why should you use a soft lime-based mortar? It's not just because we told you so. It's because if you use a hard mortar base, it may result in the mortar being harder than the brick, which could cause failure of the brick over time. So all that's explained in there in a way that provides helpful information to the applicant as they're weighing various solutions. I want to talk a little bit about specific guidelines and applying those guidelines. Okay, and I'm going to focus on two areas in particular, what I call the hot spots, the ground zero for design review issues. And that's synthetic sidings and, of course, windows. Those are the two, I think, areas where the Commission sees the most application requests, and those are the most difficult ones to deal with. So let's look at a few of them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the guidelines themselves and what they say. And this is verbiage taken specifically from the Madison Design Guidelines. So let's remind ourselves of what those guidelines say. First of all, exterior siding materials are essential components defining a building's architectural character. We talked about the Secretary of the Interior standards. We talked about historic integrity in design. We acknowledge that siding materials are important to define the character of a building. Original exterior siding should be preserved and maintained. That is a goal, that is a tenet of our design guidelines. The interior wood siding should be repaired or replaced with wood siding to match the original. Here's an example of a property that Indiana Landmarks owns. House that I was involved with. We have a frame building here. This is the rear elevation. And you can see where we had to replace deteriorated siding, but we tried to match the siding that was there. And again, we didn't say, well, it all looks kind of ratty, we'll just rip it all off and put all new in. We weaved in and tried to only repair the areas that were deemed beyond repair. And I'll use this project as an illustration for several of these. If original wood siding is severely deteriorated, it is siding for siding. We tried to match species. We tried to weave it in here to the building. Here's some more photos from the same house that's taken from the street elevation. You can see originally this house, which dates to about 1875. The porch was added around 1915, 1918. Was covered with asbestos shingles. So we really didn't know what the original material was underneath. But what we decided to do was to experiment and investigate, obviously, what the condition was of the original material. Removal of added synthetic sidings that have been added to a building is highly encouraged, followed by restoration of the original wood siding. So, knowing that the guidelines encourage the removal of the synthetic siding and encourage restoration of the original siding, that obviously prompted us to what? To investigate what was the condition of the siding. And no, we could not make that assessment by taking off 3 pieces of the asbestos shingles and declaring that the wood siding was too deteriorated to repair. We took it off the entire building. And in this particular situation, we were actually pleasantly surprised. Asbestos had been on there since probably late 1940s. And I'd say 85% to 90% of the original wood siding was in reasonably good condition and could be saved with this building. Here's the before, and here's the after of the same building after we repaired and painted and restored the building's exterior. But again, you can see we had soffits deteriorated, we had porches caving in, and so often you get buildings in this condition and say, oh, it's all rot. We're just, we know the siding. Given the condition of the porch, it's obvious that the siding is falling off as well. So again, we were able to demonstrate through our project, and I'll show you just a few more photographs. I showed you before this picture. This is what the rear addition looked like when we purchased the property. There was a porch on it that had pulled off the building. It actually was going out about 6 to 8 inches in this section of the building. Of course, water had gotten in and it rotted. All that siding was pretty much gone. But we were able to, again, do selective repair, and then you can see after it's painted, it all works well together and runs in. And here's another image of the before, during process, after we had taken off all these asbestos shingles. You can see the wood siding, remarkably in a lot of good condition. Yes, we did have some spot areas that we had to repair, but overall, that's a fairly small, insignificant amount when you think about the size of this frame house. And then here's the building after. Synthetic siding. Let's talk a little bit about that. The application of synthetic or substitute materials such as vinyl or aluminum over original wood siding is not appropriate. It may cause, conceal, or accelerate structural damage. In cases where original wood siding has been removed, the Historic District Board of Review may allow for the application of synthetic siding as long as the materials match the appearance of the original sheathing materials. Here's an unfortunate example. This I took about 3 weeks ago in Jeffersonville. Unfortunately, not in a locally designated historic district, but a house that had really a remarkably intact exterior. Siding was in overall good condition, and what are they doing? They're vinyl. And you can see, we always hear, oh, well, we can save features. Well, here's the soffit going up. And gosh, you know what? We can't make cuts like that, so the decorative rafter ends end up being encased in the new vinyl soffit. Well, let's pull off the quarter board here because it projects out a little bit more. So, we're ripping off elements of the original siding so we can apply vinyl. And they had already gone in by the time I got there and covered over the triangular knee braces, which were open knee braces with vinyl. You can see now there are these solid mass projections on the front of the building. And, by the way, all the windows had already been replaced by the time I got there to take a picture. So, someone has spent a lot of money to do something that, if you saw from our previous slide, had we done the project, it would have been a paint and maybe window reglazing project. Instead, they've invested in a lot of money and really have altered the character and defining features of this historic property. To be approved, the application of synthetic